All right, so thank you all for joining. A very wholehearted welcome to this webinar, which takes place in the Leading Turbulent Times series. My name is Katharina Lange, and I am affiliate professor here at IMD, Professor of Leadership. And yes, revolutions are always turbulent times. And Will Our Kids Lead the Revolution was one of the subtitles I thought of, because the generational shifts we observe might cause turbulences as well. And today in the webinar, I would like to take you through some of these turbulences, some of these dynamic shifts, and invite you to some thought experiments. So the idea is to let you see your generation a little bit more clearly, and hopefully that helps you to see the dynamics between the different generations also a little bit more clarity. So the inspiration for this webinar I got from a book that I read recently and enjoyed very much. It's Robert Greene's Laws of Human Nature. And he says, fundamentally, you are born into a generation that defines you more than you can imagine. So my idea was, how could it be that there's something in me that I have not really reflected deeply enough about? How did my generation shape me? And so today's webinar is trying to speak about the generational myopia. This is how Robert Greene labeled his chapter 17, where he speaks about these dynamics. And I thought this to be very relevant today, as we have 4, maybe even 5 generations in the workforce, at least in society. So go with me on a little thought experiment. I invite you to imagine you're a young king who inherits a troubled kingdom from your grandfather. You are shy, you're insecure, you're afraid of making mistakes. You cling to the old traditions and rituals that give you a sense of divine authority. You have a beautiful, extravagant wife who does not understand the plight of the people around you, and you're oblivious to the signs of discontent and the revolution brewing around you. So you are Louis XVI, the 16th Ludwig of France. Now, imagine you are a teenage boy who witnesses the coronation of this king. You are fearless, adventurous, ambitious. You come from a humble background, but you rise to become a lawyer and a leader. You sense the changing mood of the times, and you join the movement to overthrow the monarchy. You're a champion of the people's rights and freedoms. In this case, you are Georges Danton, the father of the French Revolution. So this is a story of 2 men who lived in the same era, but had very different visions of the world. It is a story of one man who failed to adapt to the new challenges and opportunities of his time, while the other man seized them and shaped them to his advantage. It is a story of how one man lost his head to the guillotine, while the other one led the executions of thousands of his enemies. It is also a story how both men eventually met the same fate, betrayed by their own allies and beheaded by the same blade. The story is how history is made by choices we take, the actions we take, the risks we face. It's the story of how generations clash and change, and how ideas spread and evolve, and how power shifts and transforms. It's a story that can inspire you to think critically and creatively, and hopefully also courageously, about your own role in the world today. So, what I'm speaking about here is not exact science, but understanding the essence of your generation and the times that you live in will enable you to effectively navigate the prevailing trends. So I think there might be a problem seeing your own generation in relation to others. And I hope that today I can give a couple of questions or a couple of ideas on how we might get a better idea of the generation that we are ourselves, that we contribute to ourselves. The moment you will be able to do this, you will be able to anticipate and set the trends that resonate with your peers. And this will free you from the mental constructs that constrain or are imposed to you by your generation. And this might be allowing you to become more of the person you want to be, empowered by the freedom that brings. Each generation seeks to distinguish itself from its predecessor, so introducing new nuances into the world that reflect its values and experience. A generation approximately spans 22 years, during which it develops its taste, its values, the ways of thinking. And so these are very different from one generation to another. These generational values and ideas may limit your perspective, maybe also distorting or narrowing your mental viewpoint. And the challenge is really to understand how significantly these influence and shape your identity and worldview. So the second question today in this webinar I would like to address is, what are the generational patterns we see currently in society, in the workforce? And the third one is, so what will the next generation do? And yes, as I said, sometimes it's really hard to see the trees for the forest, right? We cannot really step outside the historical moment we are born into. And it shapes us more than we think. This is what Robert Greene stated. Our generation is shaped by events, shaped by trends, and we develop our mindset with our peers that differ very much from those of our parents and those of our parents' values. And we influence the world with our ideas, our culture, often conflicting with the older generation. They may see us as immature and spoiled, but also might envy us for our youth. This generational conflict obviously is universal and ancient years old. And when we turn 30 or 40, we will have changed the world from the world that our parents knew. We will have leaders, we have followers, we have rebels amongst us, but we will all reflect our era's spirit, even if we are in opposition to it. And as we age, our generation evolves, but the core aspect remains the same. Each era has its essence, and this involves 4 generations in our view in the moment. Their interactions create the zeitgeist. Looking back helps us to understand the dynamic that applies to the present. So that's a little bit the idea that I would like to pursue in this webinar. I would like to look at how we are shaped by the historic moment that we stepped into with our birth, how we can get more awareness to identify the patterns of our own generation. And then lastly, hopefully this distance will create a little, or this moment will create a little bit of distance and elevation to help us look above the chaos of the moment. So there are 4 generational patterns, and they have been, as I said, described for many, many hundreds of years. This is resolving in an old Islamic philosopher. And so he observed that there are essentially 4 different generational patterns present. It starts with the revolutionaries. Those are the ones who are breaking with the past. They establish the new values. They're creating chaos in that process. And this is obviously causing, conflict, tensions. And this is a new start, a new era beginning. The next generation will seek to establish order. They're striving to bring order into the chaos. They still feel the heat of the revolution. They're still a little bit burned maybe by it, but they want to establish new conventions, new norms, new values. The third generation following this are the pragmatists. The pragmatists want to solve problems. They want to make life as comfortable as possible. The revolution feels a little bit removed. And this generation is typically more individualistic in their approach. They don't feel that collectively bound or obliged. And then comes the 4th generation in this cycle, and they are a little bit more insecure. They feel that society has lost its vitality. They're more okay with breaking with the past. They are unsure how to replace the lost vitality or with what to replace it. And they question their inherited values. And from there on, the crisis slowly emerges. And then we're back to the revolutionaries. Then comes another generation who is revolutionary, and this is replaced by new convictions, and that is replacing the old order with a new. So the cycle continues. The revolution can be extreme and violent, as in the example of the French Revolution, or it can be less intense, and it could be more of an emergence. And from there on, new values and different values might emerge. However, anarchy and lack of rules always leads to decline of democracy. Democracy is only possible with education, with civilization, with rules. So the signs for shifts are typically wars or local wars, tension and conflict, and some undermining or some conquest of countries. So these are the warning signs for revolutions to come. So this cycle, this generational pattern has been observed for many, many hundreds of years. So what can we do? What I invite you to do in this webinar is to gain a clearer view on your own generation. This is where I would like to start. So I would invite you to change the attitude towards your own generation and recognize how the spirit of your times, of the times that you were born into how this shaped our worldviews. And we often misinterpret our own generational flaws as virtues, and we avoid facing our underlying fears, such as seeing the reluctance to own a house or a car as a desire for freedom or environmental concern. We should view the issue without judgment or morality and just as objectively as possible. I know it's difficult, but this approach allows us to connect with the zeitgeist and become trendsetters instead of merely followers or rebels of our own generation. And then what helps in this process is to really create a profile, maybe a personality profile, if you like, for your own generation. So imagine, and you are part of a generation of young people who have witnessed certain major events or trends that have shaped you. Could be a war, could be a crisis, could be a technological breakthrough. How did this affect your socialization, your values, your aspiration, your creativity, and your expression? How did it influence your entry into the workforce, your methods of achieving success, of achieving wealth, your experiences of failure? How did the parenting style of the previous generation mold you? How do you relate to the opposite gender and how do you relate to the older generation? How are your heroes and icons shaped and what do they represent? What are the trends and fads that capture your attention and what are the underlying psychological appeals to it? What is your sense of humor? What does it reveal about your dark side? And what are your leanings and hidden desires? These are all questions you can ask yourself to understand the essence of your own generation and really to capitalize it on the present. You need to focus on the shared traits, so really the big themes rather than minor derailers or details and outliers. So you need to really consider the significant events that occurred when you were between 10 and 18, maybe 20 years old. This will define the characteristics of your generation. You need to examine the interactions between the concurrent generations as they will also contribute to the zeitgeist. And you need to look back at the past decades to see how they have shaped the present. We are also dependent on those who went before us, obviously. And you need to rewrite or write that narrative that can be read to really engage with it. So that's the second. And how do we arrive at the zeitgeist? We're putting these pieces together to form it. We should focus on the relationships between the two main generations present. So these are the young adults, those who are 22 to 42 years of age, and the midlife individuals who are around 45 to 66 years of age, roughly that time frame. And we need to explore the tensions between them. Maybe there's resentment, maybe there's envy, and the differences in values and perceptions to identify which generation is influential and where the power dynamics are changing. And additionally, we also should consider our generation and how it fits into the larger historical context. Really, to overcome these generational biases, we need to see the world from our parents' view and from our children's view, and ideally also from our grandparents' view. Maybe there's some adoption to their values. We can be realistic and pragmatic. We might value teamwork and our own individual spirit. But with a clear mind, we can really remove these blockages and illusions. So how do we do this? And why shall we continue doing that? I would like to attempt to give you a reading of the general patterns currently present. I will go through 4 generations and I will add a 5th. And I will try to identify or present or offer to you my view on how I see the current generations present, just to give you a conversation starter. How do I shape them? How do I arrive at my conclusion? Well, firstly, I look at the key events that shaped that generation in young adulthood, like in the age of 12 to 18, maybe 20 or 22 years of age. What happened in that generation? I also look at the outcome of this. So how did these events shape the generation? What influence did this have on education, on the value system that is transferred from one generation to another? What impact did it have on relationships, romantic relationships, but also formative relationships? And what impact does it have on physical well-being or being, like food, like housing, like clothing? So it sounds pretty trivial, but you see that there are fundamental differences between the generations. Okay? So I would like to start with the silent generation. This is the generation that grew up or that was born between 1928 and about 1946. And this generation grew up as children of war and depression. So this generation was too late to be war heroes and too early to be the teenagers of free spirits. Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, gives a very impressive account of that. So I will always recommend a belletristic novel to get a little bit more context if you're interested to get the feel of that generation. This lonely crowd, as it was also sometimes called, became risk-averse technicians and experts. And together with the more sensitive rock and rollers and the civil rights activists, they lived in a post-crisis area of conformity where they seemed to like a sure ticket to success. It was an industry-led society, and in the middle of life, there was a very fearful passage. This was a generation that was torn between wars, that was torn between stubborn older people and passionate younger ones. And the rise to power coincided with the fragmentation of families, with cultural diversity, institutional indecision, and a multitude of legal disputes. This generation, nevertheless, held very much strong traditional values. So cultural and social forces emphasized values such as hard work, loyalty, thriftiness. This silent generation was financially prudent. They had interpersonal respect, determination, resilience, a very strong work ethic, and of course, analog sensibilities. Digital was not around yet. And there was also a sense of self-sacrifice. Food was very much appreciated. Indeed, it was absolutely welcome because this generation has suffered from depression and wars. There was just too much hunger after these hard times after the two world wars. And clothing was very formal. It was formal for each education. There was a Sunday suit or dress for church. There was an appropriate attire for dinner and at work anyways. The relationships mimicked the industrial age and were seen as having to be productive. So families were part of a social security system and children were part of that productive care system. And if you want to think about representatives of this generation, maybe there's Walter Mondale, Woody Allen, Martin Luther King, Anne Frank, Mikhail Gorbachev. And you see that many of them have already silently left our planet. So this was the silent generation, the first one in our cycle. Now I'm going to the boomers who are in our generational ones who are establishing order. And I love to listen to Ezra Klein's podcast. And the other day there was a book club, and he described a book by Jill Filipovic. And the book was entitled, "Okay, Boomer, let's talk about how my generation got left behind." And he summarized it nicely as, this book is a very nice encapsulation of the economic case for millennial rage. And he said that boomers these days are criticized for everything that has gone wrong, at least from a United States point of view. Is this so? So the boomers generation, they bask a little bit in the sun as children of Dr. Spock and the freedom of movement. There was a lot of suburban conformism, and maybe the father knows best smudges. They witnessed the space race. They saw the rise of nuclear energy and nuclear power and the onset of the Cold War. They moved in a way from the summer of love to the days of anger, and they grew rebelling against the worldly designs of their parents. They claimed to be the flower power referees of public morality. And then in the early 80s, many of the adult young yuppies convened to mainstream careers and still had rather perfectionistic lifestyles with mostly the economic tailwinds of these days. And then in the early 90s, when entering the middle life and moving into national power, they trumpeted values and visions and promoted politics of meaning. So today, many boomers move to retirement, handing over the power to the next generations. And you find here on my slide represented another podcast that I really love and enjoy. It's the Boom podcast from The Economist, highlighting 6 different important episodes in the lifespan of boomers and contributing to why they make such a fundamental power in at least the US politics. And I believe the lessons from there can be learned for around the globe. So it's, from my point of view, really worth listening into. In general, the boomers have a good sense of competition. They tend to be self-sufficient and optimistic at work. And in their parental guidance, the children still have chores and need to participate in the family's duties. So, however, it's not as functional as it were in the previous generation. And in the relationships, the women also are increasingly more freedom and power. So, but children are still an important part of the family, contributing relationally to it. The entire relationship era leads to establishing on more equal partners here. We see this also in the number of divorces that increase, and this might go hand in hand with the number of cities that are growing. And so bigger cities can accommodate single people a little bit more easily and more anonymously than it was possible on the countryside. So there's a change in the social structure and the social fabric due to the developments of those days. So some of these factors, why we see that family societal are contributing to why we see the family as a societal institution slowly falling apart. Not totally, obviously, but it's deteriorating at the fringes. Food becomes more seasonal, becomes more varied. There's more offerings, there's more choices. And still parents determine what gets eaten on the family table. It's not the children. So examples for this generation are, for example, Bill or Hillary Clinton, George or Laura Bush, Tony Blair, Benjamin Netanyahu. So these politicians have been very, very powerful. And we see that they are now, as I said, slowly retiring and giving way to the next generation, as we have just seen recently in the US. Now, let's go to the next generation, the Gen X. The Generation X is this generation that survived, if I may say so, an accelerated speed up childhood with maybe divorce, maybe they were latchkey children. There were multiple educational reforms also here in Europe with open classrooms and along with cable TV and a shift in the age limit for films that changed societal norms maybe more profoundly than we would be aware of. The Gen X grew up hearing that they were so wild and so stupid that they were endangering the nation. And the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall maybe might have fueled that unprecedented optimism and maybe also unprecedented globalization that grew from there. At work, the Gen Xers were willing to take risks, and they prefer work that is freelancing or maybe working for startups, and they prefer this over a loyal company affiliation. Their access to the exciting new opportunities of the internet created the lure of fast entrepreneurship. And you will have known or will have remembered the dot-com bubble that then eventually burst, but this created a lot of excitement and a lot of hype. From grunge to hip hop, their fragmented culture revealed a hardened individualistic tone, an individualistic tone of not necessarily belonging. And spare time is really important and to this Gen X generation, and almost all is allowed as long as it's fun. And when I speak in these deterministic terms, it's obviously trying to paint a picture. It is always it's never the individual that I'm talking about. It's always the impression, the trend that we identify here. Yeah, so as individualistic as this generation is, anything is never about the individual. So in the Gen X generation, food is in service of the individualistic fun lifestyle. There might be deep frozen and convenience food, and this prevailed over self-cooked family meals. It was more important to just have it conveniently at your hand. As young adults, this generation maneuvered their way through the sexual battlefield of AIDS, and they married rather cautiously. That put a cause for caution here on their relationships. Their children then, and here we're moving slightly to the next generation, became increasingly shiny objects because there were fewer of them, and they are fueled by this competition of making my child the best and brightest. So this unfortunately had an impact on the education that already underwent a dramatic change, and real value-based education became, to some, or if not many of parents in this generation, rather secondary to the status of their children, rather secondary to the validation that they perceive from the children. Today in midlife, many of the Gen Xers have moved into a political and corporate leadership role and feel less like winners than tough survivors. They're seeking safe havens for themselves and their families. And examples of this generation are Barack Obama, Sarah Palin, Tom Cruise, Quentin Tarantino, Princess Di, Tony Cameron, Michael Jordan. These are all representatives of the Gen X, Generation X. Now, we're coming to the fourth generation, our wheel, the millennials. And the millennials are, in our generational wheel, the so-called insecure. So what were the trends that shaped them? The millennials first emerged during the era of the baby on board signs, coinciding with declining rates of abortion and declining rates of divorce. So this child-centric pop culture really became louder. They were seen as exceptional, and from an early age on, they were told they were the most wonderful, brilliant, talented children ever. Their parents used rather a hands-off approach and preferred an attachment parenting rather than really the traditional reining them in. Child welfare, child abuse prevention, child safety became very prominent issues, and books that promoted virtues, values, and teamwork turned into real bestsellers. In this generation, teachers catered to parents' preferences. There was a heightened concern in education with helicopter parenting, and with the volume, with the rigor and the content, the school curricula slowly diminished and became a little bit less deep. And as the millennials transitioned into their teenage years in the late 90s, there was an increase in volunteer work and community service, a wholehearted approach to contribute to the society, accompanied by a notable decline in alcohol consumption and smoking and violent crime. When they entered the workforce in the early 2000s, progressive employers really introduced security measures, feedback structures, mentorship, and career development plans to retain their top talent. They wanted really to keep these young millennials into the workforce. And this generation also experienced the events of 9/11, the Twin Tower hijacks, and the economic fallout from the 2008 global financial crisis. The Tiananmen massacre reminded all of us about the fragility of democracy and freedom as well. So millennials are also the first digital natives. They are deeply immersed in social media with impacts on communication skills and obviously also on social relationships. Food has become a means of self-expression, exemplified by the popularity of posting it on social media. And my icon is here, the avocado toast, symbolizing this desire for superfood, and maybe not necessarily with taking into account all the other cost of its production. So part of this generation are Mark Zuckerberg, LeBron James, Miley Cyrus, Prince William, and also Justin Bieber. Now, how does this shift? Let me stop here with the parental shifts, and let's talk a minute about what this means for the shifts between the generations. So we had the silent generation, we had the booming generation as the establishing order ones, we had the pragmatists, those were the Generation X, and we had the insecure. And all of them have different forms of power. All of them have different forms of dynamics between them. There's one generation I have not yet talked about, and if we look at the logic of this cycle, if we buy into this, and this is the thought experiment here, there's the generation of the Generation Z, the Generation Alpha. So how do they play a part in this game? How do we fold them? How do we describe them? And here I again, since these might be some of your children, they're of course not your children I'm talking about. I'm talking about all the other children that you see. I'm talking about all the other teenagers out there on the streets, not yours, but the ones of your neighbors in school, etc. So I'm trying to describe them, and please do disagree with me. This is again a moment of trying to make sense of what we're seeing. It's not a specific science, it's a thought experiment, as I said in the beginning. So if I compare the two, if I compare the silent generation and the Gen Z, then both generations are very cautious with career choices. Millennials' insecurities were intensified by the pandemic's impact. So they had to suffer from closed schools, from remote learning, from social isolation, and their face-to-face communication was very much reduced. Future threats, of course, include the climate change, the food safety concerns, and AI obviously is impacting jobs and relationships. So the narrative around the climate catastrophe is ubiquitous and for several, an open invitation to rebel against the establishment, the generation of the parents and grandparents that has wasted the planet. Food has turned almost into a threat as well. There are so many toxins, allergens, there's always pollution. You might get the impression that food has become an enemy or is making you sick. And then artificial intelligence obviously represents a threat, tangible or not, for foods, for relationships, for society as a whole. A very good read is Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. It paints a picture of a rather dystopian social future, of this social disruption that occurs when AI becomes real. But the book also offers a consoling sliver of hope, so I highly, highly recommend reading it. These issues, in my view, contribute to a deep perception of anxiety. Jonathan Haidt's excellent book on the anxious generation really takes a great scientific account of that. And in turn, it makes forming close relationships ever more difficult. You may see this in the evolving gender discussion as an exacerbation of this. So it isn't clear how to approach one another. Communication is muted, is maybe only happening through social media, we're rarely face-to-face. And this generation appears to have an even less understanding of the world, despite having unprecedented access to resources outside the web. Maybe this is due to the overprotection of helicopter parents, but maybe they just retreated to a virtual realm where they can go and roam freely. However, this comes with a distortion of reality, as we might be aware. So with declining birth rates, children have become increasingly rare and hence more valuable. And they can be certain that their parents pay attention and their efforts and are really abundantly to make the child a success, the reflection of their own success. And if I may say so, the narcissistic undertone here in this dynamic is very difficult to overlook. So allow me to exaggerate a little bit by saying that within a century, children have evolved from being productive family members to contribute to the family as a system to becoming the rulers of the house. I know I'm exaggerating here, and you might disagree with it, but see it as a thought experiment for a moment with a rule of thumb. It cannot come as a surprise then that nowadays many parents continue to support their adult children. Instead of sending their children away to their own lives, with their own chores, with their own disappointments, with the dangers of an own life, but also with its rewards, children are rather kept under the parent's roof or under the parent's financial umbrella. In my view, and again, you might disagree with me, this breeds a quite unhealthy dynamic. What I mean with that is the following. So my question is then, do our children, will our kids really lead the revolution? And again, this is a thought experiment. It's not scientific science. It's just an idea to think through. And what I invite you to do is pretend you were at the optometrician. Pretend you were at the doctor's appointment and he tries to find the right lens for you. He finds the right glasses for you. So if you're there, you have these contraptions in front of your eyes and they insert one or the other new lens. And if you bear with me for a minute, I offer you a little lens. If you see the word clearer, fine. If not, you can dismiss it. It's one way of trying to make sense of it. And maybe it's a lens that helps you. So if you're ready for the thought experiment, bear with me. What if, and this if bears some weight. I see your question, Andrea. I'm happy to come to it in a minute. Let's use for a moment, the lens of the dark triad for a thought experiment. What I mean with dark triad, it's a framework that has been published about 20 years ago. It contains 3 edges. It contains narcissism, and to make it very simple, narcissism means I'm the greatest, I'm the biggest, I'm the wealthiest, I'm the prettiest, I'm the best that there is. So it's all about me. And this is something that you might have seen or might not have seen, but this is something that is prevailing as a trend, as a psychopathic trend. The second part of that triangle is Machiavellism. So Machiavellistic people, in a one sentence, they try to get everyone to do what they want. They try to look for angles to achieve their objectives, to achieve what they aim for. And then lastly, there's psychopathy. This is clearly not liking anyone else, not liking people, not liking anything on this planet. And clearly, not all of this becomes manifest. And we would say from evidence that around 3% of the society has a combination, has psychopathic clinical manifestations of it. Depending on how the society pushes back on it, it becomes a little less. If society doesn't push back as much, it becomes a little bit more. But just employed as a lens, have we seen these behaviors? And what if this dark triad became more prevalent due to also a failure of parental guidance in pushing back on sociopathic behaviors? When children become shiny objects, when less children are born, the children automatically have a higher status due to their rarity. So what is rare becomes more precious. Social media also promotes instant gratification and unfortunately supports narcissistic tendencies in general. So there's also a remoteness of the traditional values in the parental generation X or in the boomer generation. And now I even have one more lens for you that has been discussed recently, and that is, what if it was a dark pet trait? If we not only had narcissism, Machiavellism, and psychopathy, but also sadism present more prevalently in this generation. Why do we suggest this? Because we spoke with you about the anxieties that exist, and we know that sadistic or sadism can root in anxiety, can root in anxiousness, can root in fear. That's one data point. And then if we think about how our children have been sexually enlightened, they very rarely have a conversation with their parents, and they very rarely flock to books or magazines anymore. We know from statistics that pornographic internet pages are by far the most visited pages, and the likelihood that our kids will have experienced or will have flocked or will have gone to these pages is pretty high, so that they have observed it. Porn, unfortunately, is sadism, right? It's not a relationship that you would like to promote on a healthy basis. So what if those 4 elements gave us a lens onto which we could look at our younger generation? Would we then think that our generation, that our kids will lead the revolution? Well, I leave this one to you. I leave this one to your judgment. This is the thought experiment. I thank you for embarking with me on it. And let me hand over the microphone to you. I see Andrea saying agree. However, there are some economic factors that play, such as initial salaries too low. Yes, that was a fallout from the previous economic crises, cost of living spiraling out of control. And yet I would argue, thank you for the question, Andrea, and yet I would argue this is something that other generations have faced before, right? So how much are we willing to let our kids explore these hardships by themselves? I'm happy to debate. Any other reactions? Are you conforming? Are you agreeing? Is this something so outrageous that you say no? Charlene, you say, this sounds so scary. Are there any positive correctors called the lens you introduced is so negative? Yes, unfortunately, it's a negative lens. And I try to provoke, because if you look at the generational circle, the fifth generation is potentially the revolutionary one. I don't want to say everyone is. Please don't take it as that one. I just want to sharpen our eye on this, whether we as or me as a Gen Xer can do more to help this generation to find their feet, find the values that make sense for them. Loneliness and Gen Z puts to extremes. So the question is, can we engage them? Can we encourage them in more relationship? Can we, for example, how often do we grant them access to social media and internet? How much more do we invite them into our real world? Can we leave stuff behind to engage more intensely with them? Andrea said, I agree with most points. When I think like this, I wonder, wasn't each generation having, yes, that's the universal one, absolutely. So this is always the younger generation thinks the older ones are completely decoupled, and the older generation thinks they are immature. Maybe they envy us for the youth. Absolutely. This is an old game, absolutely, or an old view. And at the same time, here I find when I apply this dark tetrade to the current generation, I find that there are things that I should be aware of as someone who has educational responsibility, for example, right? So how can I use this to harness potential dangers coming along? Rodriguez, I just think maybe one factor was left behind, the easiness to have different cultures and nationalities to everyone in the world connected and even living as our neighbors. Would this characterization be a different generations apply, India or China? Well, I think these generational dynamics are to some extent global. I do believe absolutely there are cultural differences depending on the access to certain trends. And yet at the same time, I believe it's also a moment for us to just double check, ask ourselves, what can we contribute to maybe prevent this from happening, right? There is a geographical realities play a role. For instance, if you're born in a poor country in Africa, you would perhaps not be shaped in the same way as you were born in the US. Absolutely. So, yes, absolutely. There are trends that are far more local. And this is, again, whenever you're trying to describe a larger trend, you're always short of certain specifics. Absolutely agree. There is a great comment here I would add to Andrea, remark on cultural impact. The South culture in Europe has developed a more supportive society for the next generation, not only due to economic reasons, but also family notions. Yes. So in some societies, family is very, very strong as a value, right? And this is where you also see multiple generations sitting together at a family table, discussing with another. So the transgenerational knowledge is more easily transferred from one another. When your parents live far away, it's hard to learn from them how to take care for your own little child, right? And the generational distance in years has also increased. So typically these days, children are born at the later age of the mother. So that increased the generational age or distance between the different generations, which is also not helping with the knowledge transfer between them. Very good point. I love the idea. So thank you all for really embarking on this thought experiment. I know it was a bit dark. It's a tough topic to look at, and it requires a lot of courage also to address these points. It's something that I also do not regularly, or I don't like to do. And at the same time, I think it's important that we have a close look also onto our own generation. How have we contributed to the situation? And then also thinking, how can we resolve it? How can we address these issues? Can we make our next generation as successful as we want them to be, wholeheartedly, individually, and also as a collective, as a generation? There's another debate. Andrea, one more debate. As someone more and more involved in sustainability, it doesn't seem to me as Gen Y is truly interested and active in bringing about meaningful change, but rather complaining about previous generations screwing up. Taking the talk and flying often left and right at the earliest occasion. That's an interesting observation. Thank you. Yes, values are the backbone of a society. When the values are so distant from one generation to another, this can trigger conflict. Education is key. I couldn't agree more, Salvador. I think education is absolute key. Democracy is only based on education and civilization. So rule or lack of rules, lack of education, lack of civil ways of working, living with one another is is detrimental to democracy. And I didn't go here today, but we see that the willingness to fight for democracy is also on its decline, right? And if you look at the social media situation, these are not labeled media companies. Social media can publish anything they like. This is not fact check, and they can build big monopolies. So this is another threat to our democracy, in my view. This is why I would also support really hardworking journalism wholeheartedly, because they do an important work in our democratic system. And so education absolutely is one. We are there to educate our children in values, hopefully also conveying that democracy is an important value. And yes, I think we as parents, for those of you who are parents, have our share to do. I have my 2 children myself, so I feel encouraged. I feel hopefully that I need to really reinforce these components in this generation wherever I can. Great. So I think I'm almost at the end of this webinar. Thank you, Virginia, for your kind comment. It's very, yes, it's a thought experiment. It's an invitation to think about what if. See it as that, see it as a provocative thought to leave you with on a Wednesday lunchtime. And I look forward to hearing from you. I do have another slide, which is my email and my LinkedIn account. So if you'd like to connect with me, I would be delighted. Maybe we can enter a conversation here. And if you are at IMD, please let me know. I'm happy to meet up and have a continuation of this conversation. So thank you very, very much. And I wish you all a very productive morning, lunch, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. So it's evening in Hong Kong already. It's lunchtime in Europe, and maybe it's morning in the US. So thank you very much, and see you soon, hopefully here at IMD. Bye-bye.